Our actions speak louder than words. The impact of the Supreme Court case Tinker v. Des Moines in Iowa from 1965 to 1969 by Davy Ryan, Junior Division, Junior Individual Documentary. When thinking of the most famous Supreme Court cases, Tinker v. Des Moines may not be the first case that comes to mind. It was a court case made by the Independent School District in Des Moines against Mary Beth Tinker, John F. Tinker, and Christopher Eckhart for protesting the Vietnam War by wearing black armbands to school.
It involved a very peaceful, quiet protest by 5 young people who chose to wear black armbands to school in support of a moratorium on fighting in Vietnam during the Christmas holiday, and they were responding to a national suggestion that had been made by Senator Robert Kennedy.
In December of 1965, a group of adults and students in Des Moines held a meeting. The group determined to publicize their objections to the Vietnam War and their support for a truce by wearing black armbands during the holiday season and by fasting on December 16th as well as New Year's Eve. The 3 public school students in Des Moines, Iowa were suspended from school for wearing black armbands to protest the government's policy in Vietnam. Thesis statement. The Vietnam War, the Des Moines Independent School District putting a ban on disruptive clothing, and the Tinker children being influenced by their activist parents led up to the Supreme Court case of Tinker v. Des Moines, which in turn led up to giving students the rights for symbolic speech, students learning that their opinions and thoughts matter, and the Supreme Court case of Hazelwood School District versus Coolhamere. The Vietnam War was one of the causes for the Tinkers and Mr. Eckhart to protest because they did not agree with the U.S. entering the war. In fact, they believed the U.S. shouldn't have a thing to do with the war. Many Americans disagreed with the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. They disagreed because they questioned whether sacrificing American lives for an unuseful war was worth it. They also hated the war because it gave many of the soldiers' families problems once they returned. One problem that reoccurred was Vietnam Syndrome. Vietnam Syndrome was when a soldier had reoccurring memories of the war. It was a terrible experience, and many soldiers experienced terrible pain. This is one of the reasons why many U.S. citizens hated the war.
It was important for me to wear the armband to school because I was very sad about the Vietnam War, and I thought young people should have a right to speak up and express their feelings too.
The armbands the students had worn had been black ones wrapped around their upper arms and had a peace sign on them. They symbolized the fact that the students would prefer peace over the Vietnam War. Another reason for the students to wear the black armbands was because, just before they started the protest, the school put a ban on disruptive items, such as armbands or clothing. The third cause for the protests was, the Tinker parents were described by their children as activists against discrimination as well as the Vietnam War. The same day that the students wore the armbands to school, they were suspended. Soon after, their parents filed a court case attempting to sue the school. It was during this time in 1966 that the students and their families set in motion what would become a First Amendment landmark, the case of Tinker v. Des Moines Independent Community School District, which failed at both the district and the circuit court levels. The Des Moines School Board met to review the principal's rule. They supported the ruling because they decided that principals needed the authority to keep order in the schools. The Vietnam War was becoming a very emotional issue across the country, and school officials were afraid that there could be disturbances at school if protest symbols showed up in class. The case did not end there, however. In March of 1966, John Tinker, Mary Beth Tinker, Chris Eckhart, and their parents filed a formal complaint against the U.S. District Court, arguing that the students' rights had been violated. The district court dismissed the case, as did a federal appeals court. The case finally reached all the way to the United States Supreme Court on November 12th of 1968. The case was argued before the U.S. Supreme Court on November 12, 1968, and the decision was handed down in favor of the students on February 24th of 1969. The final ruling was 7-2. Eckhart said watching Johnston argue the case in front of the Supreme Court justices was a moment that he said he will never forget. the case was over, Christopher Ackhart quoted, "It shaped my life, it affected my life, and I loved it all." One effect from the Supreme Court case was, it gave students the right to make symbolic speech. They could do this as long as it wasn't out of line and disruptive to other students' learning. Another impact of the court case was, it taught students of all ages that their opinions matter and that they have a right to express them, but they also need to understand the weight of that right. Middle and high school students are at an important stage of their social and intellectual development, a stage in which they are shaping their personalities, learning how to behave in society, and becoming good citizens. If authorities fail to respect or protect students' constitutional rights in school, then there is a pretty good chance that these students will be less likely to respect or protect those rights when they grow up and graduate. During the Supreme Court case, Justice Abe Fortas said,
"It can hardly be argued that either students or teachers shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate."
Lastly, as a result of students getting recognized and their opinions as well as speech recognized, new Supreme Court cases rose in response. Hazelwood School District versus Coolhermere in 1988 was a landmark decision by the Supreme Court of the United States, which held that public school curriculum student newspapers that have not been established as forums for student expression are subject to a lower level of the First Amendment protection than independent student expression or newspapers established by policy or practice as forums for student expression. Thank you, Tinkers and Eckhart, for protecting our rights.